not the backbone of Mediterranean trade? Advanced commercial networks, bywords for unimaginable wealth and splendor. Wealth of West Africa would be known throughout Europe. The story begins with the emergence of the Trans-Saharan trade. Gold, that virtually impenetrable metal that has consumed the ambitions and twisted the moral foundations of many. Power in civilization itself. Its rarity always at the foundation of its utility. You might be wondering, what does West Africa have to do with this magical mineral? That's what I'm here for. You see, the story begins with the emergence of the Trans-Saharan trade. It was the backbone of Mediterranean trade, which itself powered the rest of medieval Europe before the colonial exploitation of the New World. You might be wondering, why have I never heard about this? Why do they never teach it in the history books? Is it a conspiracy? No. It's a number of reasons. Very difficult to study. A lot of the manuscripts are just being translated now. Also, there was a kind of colonialist perception that Africa hadn't really produced anything. That apart from the ancient civilizations we all know about in North Africa, Egypt, Sudan, that there wasn't really anything to find in West Africa. Traditionally, the Sahara, which is almost a 9 million square kilometer, almost entirely arid region, was viewed as a kind of separator between the peoples of the north and south. And the continent that came below it was seen as kind of a dark continent, disconnected, primitive, unrelated to the scholarly civilizations of the West and the East. Thankfully, as more evidence came to light and historians began to seriously focus on the Sahara, there was a culture change. Now we largely conceptualize it as a metaphorical sea rather than a barrier. Think of it as kind of a desert Mediterranean. Now, as you might imagine, if you see in one of those maps that portrays the real tremendous size of West Africa, the Sahara is massive. The cultures and civilizations, kingdoms, tribes, so on and so forth, that made up the Sahara are immense in scale and too vast to describe. So I'm going to focus on the imperial centers of the empires of the Western Sudan and Central Sudan. And by Sudan, I don't mean modern day Sudan. I mean the area that was traditionally known as the Sudan. So this extends all the way from kind of Chad and Mali to Senegal on the coast. And in doing so, I will document how political consolidation, Islamization formed and molded the institutional arrangements and networks that would characterize the global highway that the Trans-Saharan trade would soon become. This is a two-part story. But if you want to uncover the story of how this trade emerged and its tremendous influence on the Mediterranean and broader European civilization, then we need to focus on the 14th to early 16th century. For this, we have to look at Islam. Now, trade existed before. Archaeological evidence indicates that trade between North and South had persisted since at least the 5th century AD. But its scale was limited. Why? Communication. The Islamization of West Africa changed this in two main regards. The spread of the North African and Rwanda trade networks of merchants and the economic implications of Islamic cultural practices. Islam initially spread throughout West Africa via North African merchants in the 11th century. Networks of Muslim merchants settled within or corresponding to urban centers and would be key transmitters of Islamic knowledge. This process of merchant-facilitated conversion would establish the conditions for large-scale trans-Saharan trade in two respects. Firstly, the spread of Islamic cultural and legal frameworks that they initiated would create the institutional and social relations necessary for long-term trade. As conveyed by the historian Lovejoy, trade in the Sahara was a lengthy process that necessitated a distinct division of labor and consistent coordination between parties without a well-established political authority to mediate disputes and set legal guidelines for trade. What does this mean? This meant trading depended heavily on trust. And that's what Islam provided, a mutual framework for trust. You see, as highlighted by Austin, the formation of the early members of the Rwanda merchant caste in Mali, whom were almost entirely converts, was in large part a direct product of the spread of shared Islamic cultural and legal frameworks, creating a secure foundation for advanced commercial networks throughout the empire. In this period, these networks would provide a key logistical basis for long-distance trade primarily centered on the operations of the slave and gold trades, centered around Timbuktu and Gao. This is where the relevance of West African civilization to Mediterranean and Europe comes into play. You see, these networks established would not only function as trans-regional supply lines, getting textiles and foods, armor, horses, north and south, but also would create a reliance by North Africa and Europe on the West African gold at the center of the trade. This would be a mutually reinforcing process. The more Islamized West Africa got, the more trade it could do with the North. The more trade it did with the North, the richer it became. You see, not only did Islam enable the trade to expand, because merchants and traders would use Arabic literacy and access to writing paper to draw contractual agreements on which trade was established, this very literary nature would create demand for luxury goods that could only be provided north-south. The more luxury goods that came down, the more Qurans, the greater the literary culture, the more sophisticated the administration of kingdoms were, the safer trade became. These kingdoms would establish vast monopolies over the duties and taxes that came from this trade. This would often reinforce their advantage. Imagine existing in West Africa at the time. You're an Islamic kingdom, recently converted, suddenly in need of books, writing, and through that process, through that demand, you're able to establish a literary culture, a legal construction that is very similar to the North. And so traders can now operate on mutual contracts, mutual terms, which enables you to get access to even greater products. With greater commercial activity comes more taxes. And with more taxes comes the ability to demand greater and greater resources, not only from the population that you currently control, but also from the North. And so what happens? Kingdoms such as Mali and the Hausa networks in northern Nigeria are now able to demand chainmail, horses, giving them an unbeatable military advantage over their neighboring competitors. And so what happens? They continue to expand, and this process continues to reinforce in an almost cyclical manner, such that by the 14th century, there had been an unprecedented consolidation in what is modern-day Mali, Chad, northern Nigeria that had enabled kingdoms to grow and urban areas to develop to such an extent that through Islamic pilgrimage, their wealth would be known throughout the world. Places like Timbuktu will become bywords for unimaginable wealth and splendor. I'm sure if you've heard any part of this history, you know of the story of Mansa Musa, a ruler whose wealth in gold was so vast that he disrupted the local Egyptian economy when he traveled through there to get to Mecca. Because of this influence, Mali and the wealth of West Africa would be known throughout Europe. Just look at this medieval European map. See anything strange? Black guy. But I'm sure you're wondering, what happened? How come today's Africa just doesn't seem to represent the vast wealth and splendor of Mali? How come by the 17th, 18th century, it was a place that was looted, that was seen as simply a vast repository of resources, both human and natural? Well, this is complicated, and I'll tackle this in part 2, the decline of the Mali Empire and rise of European colonialism. Scholarship, money, power, wealth, territory, a mighty empire with a global the high point of pre-colonial West African Islamic civilization. One man saw the opportunity to strike everything ends. Throughout the early 16th to 18th century, the once tremendous indigenous wealth and splendor of Islamic West Africa that had accumulated through centuries of trans-Saharan trade with the North would dissipate as a vast corruption spread throughout the land. Africa has always had slavery and will continue to, but it was never the backbone of its wealth. As I detailed in my last video, the wealth of the great civilizations in West Africa was built on a trans-Saharan trade based on gold, textiles, books, and scholarly transfers as much as on slavery. But by the late 18th century, Africa had become a rotting carcass only to be picked off by vultures, both indigenous and foreign, as the human population was drained and sent into the worst forms of labor imaginable. I'm sure you're wondering, what caused this change? Well, as most things are, it's complicated. Historians are unclear as to the extent and speed of this civilizational decline due to their lack of empirical evidence. But most agree that it centers around the collapse of the African gold trade, which through Islamization, political consolidation, and demand for the commodity had emerged as the most globally significant component of Eurasian monetary flows, was severely diminished by the 18th century. Historian Austin estimates from the height of the Trans-Saharan Gold Trade in the late 15th century to its low in 1720, annual gold tonnage exports had declined from 1.5 tons per annum to 0.3. Now you might be wondering, why was there such a dramatic drop-off in this once predominant trade? Well, again, it's complicated, but historians emphasize two simultaneous historical events: the collapse of the Songhai Empire and emergence of European colonialism. Now, I'm sure European colonialism might be a little more familiar, so let's start with the Songhai. You see, the story begins with a period of Sahelian empire building in the 13th century. In this century, the Malian Empire would establish regional hegemony via monopolizing the main gold routes of the sub-Saharan trade, and by the 14th century would form a mighty empire with a global reputation, embodied by the global reach of the infamous pilgrimage of King Mansa Musa. At the same time, its capital Timbuktu would emerge as a substantial center of Islamic learning, with the entourage of Muslim scholars that would arrive in Mali with Mansa Musa following his infamous pilgrimage to Mecca, linking Mali to the rest of the Islamic scholarly world. Now I'm sure you're thinking, it sounds like the Malians really had their stuff together. Scholarship, money, power, wealth, territory. Well, as the classic saying goes, mo money, mo problems. By the late 15th century, the party would be over, as the breadth of the empire would surpass the ability of the leaders to manage. The Malians found it increasingly difficult to manage the conflicts, interests, and grievances of its subordinates sufficiently. And one man saw the opportunity to strike at its weakness. His name was Askia Muhammad, a member of the Sunni Songhai people's ruling elite, centered in the settlement of Kikuya. Askia was culturally tied to the traditions of empire, but patrilineally separated from its roots. He completed the dream of his predecessor and conquered the territory of the Malian Empire. But something unexpected happened. His conquest didn't lead to the collapse of civilization, the retreat of the scholarly tradition established by Mansa Musa. It improved it. Gone was the old system that had weakened the Malian Empire to the point of collapse, and in was a sustainable tributary model of empire based on local day-to-day control of matters by the prior existing elite. They would provide the imperial center with taxes and military assistance. In exchange, they would be largely left alone. Based on this model, the Songhai would expand further and its society would mark the high point of pre-colonial West African Islamic civilization. A sophisticated literary culture of Islamic jurisprudence and mathematics would flower, and the Bilad-e-Sudan would see unprecedented integration with the rest of the Islamic world. Moreover, under the Songhai, the Trans-Saharan trade that underpinned the wealth of Mali would reach the peak of its global relevance, with the Songhai providing the much needed stability for both desert side and river traffic on the Niger. Located in the Sahel, but with easy access to the western and central savannah, they were the hub of overland and river routes where staples of desert side trade, such as grain and salt, could be readily transferred from riverboat to camel and vice versa. Songhai economic growth was so substantial, it even rewrote the map of places unconnected to the tributary networks of the empire. Its Rangwa, sorry for the pronunciation, merchant settlers expanded their operations from Timbuktu and Gao to found commercial outposts in the emerging Bariba and Hausa towns. This migration of the Timbuktu and Gao merchant class would become the catalyst for large-scale civilizational development in what is modern-day northern Nigeria. And so you can understand why to the chroniclers of the Songhai it seemed as though an everlasting empire had been created. But in life, the only fundamental dictum is that everything ends. As the Malians once learnt from the Songhai would themselves come to understand. Pride always follows the fall. This time, collapse would stem from the international reach of the Songhai Empire. And it was a salty collapse indeed. Literally, I'm not even joking. It was about salt. You see, before modern preservatives, salt was everything. The fuel of large-scale civilization. You simply couldn't keep a city fed nor trade over a long-distance route maintained without salt. So when the Moroccans discovered the presence of large salt mines around Tagaza, Songhai territory, and sensed the opportunity to control the trade it presented, a destructive conflict would ensue. Tensions would come to a dramatic conclusion in 1591 at the Battle of Tondibi. An outnumbered Moroccan army would devastate a superior Songhai force after the disastrous decision of the Songhai commander to launch a cattle stampede that only stampeded his own army. This disaster for the Songhai opened the door for the Moroccans to conquer and raise the Songhai settlements at Tagaza and capture the core interior of the empire from Timbuktu to Gao. Now what followed? Was it similar to the Songhai where they took over the center, expanded, developed, and a new civilization formed that was even better? No. Political consolidation and diplomatic links declined within the Western Sudan region, with the polities that followed the Songhai, namely the Ama, Tudeg, and Bambara, failing to fulfill the regional legacy of their predecessor. Thanks to the contemporaneous Tadukat al-Nisayin, a detailed dictionary/encyclopedia of the ruling elite known as the Ama who followed the Songhai in Timbuktu and Gao, we have a detailed account of what followed 1591 to 1751. The Tadkirat charts how following the Moroccan invasion, the Ama state that followed would fall into what Abbot Bol regards as a state of chronic instability, whereby a mix of fierce oligarchic familial competition tied to a relatively autonomous military structure led to repeated turnover in the leadership structure known as the Pashalik. We even have stories of these repeated episodes across the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. In one particular case in 1719, civil war would see each side set up barricades in the city streets and bombard each other with gunpowder shots. This chaotic, unstable situation is where the Europeans come into the story. You see, the Songhai might have set the scene, but it was European domination of the Akan Gold Coast and flows from the Americas that would sound the death knell for the trade. And from this point, the relative importance of gold flows, and by extension, the once great Trans-Saharan trade, would never recover. Now, to explain why this happened, I need to go into a quick history of gold, at least in West Africa. Now, initially the most important early gold producing sites were Bambouk and Bure, the control of which by the Malian and later Songhai empires would define their geopolitical relevance and wealth, and most importantly, cut the Europeans off from a direct supply. Obviously, many people were not happy with this. They wanted direct access to the gold, and from this dissatisfaction, attempts to overturn the status quo would emerge. One turning point in particular started a chain of events that fundamentally shifted the balance of power towards the Europeans. You see, in the late 15th century, the Portuguese would, in search of the fabled gold of Mali, begin an expedition into the African coast. Initially, they would not find what they came for, but what they established on the west coast would create the conditions for transatlantic slavery, and what they achieved on the east would set the blueprint for the 19th century scramble for Africa. You see, in the west coast, from 1481 to 2, the Portuguese would establish a foothold with the founding of El Mina, a fortress trading output that facilitated Portuguese encroachment into gold and slave transfers. Whereas in the east, the Portuguese would adopt a strategy of direct conquest of key coastal towns such as Sofala in Mombasa. Initially, these strategies would find little success, but following the collapse of the Songhai and their control over the gold trade, efforts would be turbocharged. And by the 18th century, the gradual shift that was emerging from the 14th, from Bambara and Bure to the Akan goldfields would be fully underway. And I don't need to explain to you the horrors of slavery that accompanied this initial search for gold. But few know of the impact this horrifying trade in human beings had on the civilizations further north. You see the Songhai, you see the Malis weren't being kidnapped by enemy tribes or kingdoms and sent on the horrifying transatlantic journey. They were hundreds of miles north. But as Austin demonstrates, despite the vast distance between the coast and the Islamic kingdoms in the Sahel region, increasing European domination had a tremendous effect on the composition of its trade. You see, per annum volume of slaves traded increased from around 2,500 per year in the 15th century to 5,500 by the 18th. In other words, slavery became Islamic West Africa's most profitable export. My last video that you just saw would seem to suggest that the decline of the relevance of the Trans-Saharan Gold Trade to Europe and the Mediterranean and the emergence of transatlantic slavery indicated a full-on civilizational decline. However, some historians counter this narrative. They argue that things aren't as bad as they seem. That although it is undeniable that the former Malian Empire, Songhai Empire, and the territory centered around it underwent a period of decline, historians such as Austin have shown that the Islamization that underpinned the growth of trans-Saharan links will continue to be an accelerant. The only difference is that the location of its impact shifted. You see, following the collapse of the Songhai Empire that I detailed in my previous video, the emigrant merchant classes that had been the foundation of the empire's wealth and prosperity began to shift the development of their commercial networks towards Hausaland and Bornu, playing an increasingly central role in the economic and social development of the region. For example, historian Lovejoy states that Wangara, who were the merchants, founded the Muslim commercial diaspora in the Hausa and Bariba states and contributed significantly to the development of the central Sudan economy, such that by the late 16th century, and certainly in the 17th and 18th, the trade networks shifted eastwards to the Hausaland to Bornu to North Africa routes. This trade was on the back of an increasingly sophisticated agricultural civilization which had emerged by the late 16th century, largely displacing the former reliance of the Hausa and Bornuan people on slave exports. In this new regime, large settlements ranging from Katsina and Kano in modern-day northern Nigeria through to the Bornean capital of Benin, Gazagamu, would emerge as the centers of a commercial network based on the exportation of a wide range of textiles and salt. As also documented by Lovejoy, leather goods, especially footwear, bags, loincloths, cushions and fans became important manufactures by the 1510s, and within 50 years will probably be exported to North Africa through Bornu. And the signs of progress don't end there. As Austin alludes, the efficiency of the caravan routes would be boosted by innovations in business relations and desert politics. These innovations would largely take the form of the integration of the Sahara peoples into a formal commercial Islamic framework. This stemmed from the creation of a small sedentary oasis settlement through which Islamic scholarship and legal frameworks would spread to the people of the nomadic sultanates who were the backbone of Saharan caravan routes. You see, Islamic law would enable the integration of key Saharan intermediaries into wider existing North and Sahelian commercial networks, thereby boosting the efficiency of trade. Evidence from Austin suggests that these innovations and development of civilization in Bornu and the Hausalands would mean that the volume of trade in the 18th century surpassed that of the 15th or 18th during the height of the gold trade. These efficiency developments will be boosted by increasing export of slaves, facilitated by Alawite demand, in addition to imports of cowrie shells and greater outputs of ivory, gum arabic, and ostrich feathers. With this trade came a similar process of political consolidation that was seen in the prior period and would follow a similar pattern to that which I explained in a previous video. You see, the growth of larger and more powerful state monopolies on trade and security would form a symbiotic relationship with the growth of commercial networks, including trans-Saharan linkages. The difference this time around is that trade would no longer center around the great civilizations of the upper Niger and instead focus on the rapidly Islamizing and subsequently commercializing regions of Bornu and the Hausalands. This process would be enhanced by a simultaneous period of empire building in the north. Now you might have heard these guys. Anyone guess? I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, failed. The Ottomans. As Bornu expanded in the vein of the great Sudanic empires of yore by monopolizing key trade nodes to the south and north, they would use this predominant position and the resources that came with taxation of trade routes to reinforce their advantages over the less sophisticated neighbors. The widely accepted period of Bornean dominance during the reign of Mai Idris Aloma provides the best example of this process. Idris would expand Bornean control over trans-Saharan trade by taxing and regulating the routes through which the key trade of salt, slaves, and textiles would flow through. He would then use this monopoly position to modernize his military by importing Ottoman firearms, and this advantage he gained through the importation of Ottoman firearms would further enable greater expansion into more trade routes. And you see how the process kind of replicates. Now you might be thinking, if you see my previous videos, this sounds copy and paste like what the Hausa did, what the Malians did, and what the Songhai did. But there was a key difference with Idris that made the Bornoans stand out. He managed to get a part in Thor as well. No, I'm joking. I'm joking, guys. Though he did utilize a sophisticated strategy of diplomacy with the Ottomans to further consolidate his empire. You see, the Ottomans and Bornoans would form a kind of cartel that ensured the smoothest possible trade, but also that they could profit from it exclusively. And this was based on working together to stabilize key trade nodes in the Sahara Oasis in the central Sudan region to north routes. This is exemplified by the late 16th century diplomatic exchange over the perceived chaos wrought by Ottoman demands on Agadez, in which the Sultan agrees to reintroduce stable governance after consultation with the Bornoans. This mix of guile, Islam, military prowess, and commercial smarts meant that at the zenith of the Borno Empire between the 16th and 17th centuries, much of Hausaland and the territory extending towards Bilma and Fezzan was nominally under their control. With their vast slave armies consisting of heavily armored cavalry trained in the best modern firearms, imposing a reign of terror over neighboring tribes, forcing them to live in a state of perpetual tribute, both human and material. Impressive, right? Evil a bit by modern standards, but impressive. Now I'm sure you're thinking, does that mean that the whole narrative about the collapse of the gold trade and the decline in the civilization in West Africa and their influence was exaggerated and overstated? Well, some say that. For example, Waltz argues that the discourses of decline were somewhat overstated, with Trans-Saharan gold playing a substantial role in Egypt and Libya. But on the whole, it seems to indicate that there was a decline, that the peak of power and influence represented by the Mali and Songhai Empire was never to be achieved again. As Austin clearly establishes, African gold no longer dominated Mediterranean civilization, and no trans-Saharan commodity replaced the global significance of gold. And with it, yes, there were growing slave exports, growing exports of cowrie shells, natron, gum arabic, ivory, textiles, but none of these commodities were either as high yielding or globally significant. And so by the 19th century, neither the Hausa kingdoms nor Borno were strong enough to resist either European colonialism or the emergence of the behemoth slave state of the Sokoto Caliphate, whose spread would cement a reliance of West Africa on human goods. Historians estimate that following abolition in the US, French and British Empire, Sokoto would remain the largest slaveholding state in the world.